Good evening and welcome to TMI Live number 23, the Phoenix Playhouse. I'm glad you could be here. Here I am in the library of Eric McLuhan. 6,000 or so volumes to my estimation, and every Tuesday night I come in and I peck away at inventorying the collection. Currently I am in a couple shelves of Winston Churchill, which I'm halfway through, and so far there haven't been too many notes or annotations inside them. Here and there, the last book I did had a note about the effect of radio in the early 20th century, which actually came up earlier. Somebody sent something my way in which Quentin Tarantino commented that Hitler's demise was film, 35mm film, whereas Marshall had famously remarked that radio was the cause of Hitler's rise. Flip sides of the media coin there. So just let me finish this book here. I'm on the second, The Birth of Britain. Here's a copy of The Birth of Britain, Volume 1. If you haven't been here before, I'm making this inventory, and I'm making an account of the bare publishing data, the title, the author, publisher, condition of the book, which is pretty good. I'll do this as I'm talking. McClelland and Stewart, so that would be Canadian. (1956). Oftentimes Dad has written his name in here, but he hasn't for this one. However, there are some notes. I take a quick flip through to see if there's any actual margin notations that pop out. In the back here we do have some notes, so the notes can be really helpful because, for instance, here we have a note 217 C/A by Henry, one of the Henrys, I'm not sure which there. C/A stands for cliché to archetype, which is the process of retrieval, and it's helpful when I get an annotation like that in Marshall's work or in Eric's work, because seeing the context in which they use that annotation helps you understand what that means. In this case, cliché to archetype. So it's in English common law, and here's the annotation. Sorry, I know it will be backwards for you. In the margin here, he's written C/A. The genius of Henry II, perceiving new possibilities in such a procedure, turned to regular use in the courts as an instrument which so far had only been used for administrative purposes. Going back, so it's talking about the jury. In origin, the jury was a royal instrument of administrative convenience. The king had the right to summon a body of men to bear witness under oath about the truth of any question concerning the royal interest. It was through this early form of jury that William the Conqueror had determined the crown rights in the great Domesday survey. The genius of Henry II, perceiving new possibilities in such a procedure, new possibilities being the cliché to archetype, the process of bringing something back from the past, which is one of the quadrants in the tetrad, that of retrieval, that every technology brings something back. Technology, innovation, human artifact. There's somebody else's margin notes, not Eric's. Anyway, yeah, I wasn't sure what I was going to talk about in particular this episode. Makes note that there's few, including C/A. It being Father's Day yesterday, I thought about talking about Eric and Marshall McLuhan as fathers. But that's a bit of a sensitive subject because this was only my second Father's Day without my father, so that's a little bit raw. But anyway, let's look at it a little bit. Here's a photo of Herb McLuhan. That would be my great-grandfather, Herbert, with Eric on his shoulders. Not sure exactly where that is. It could be St. Louis or Winnipeg. And by all accounts, Herb was a fun guy, liked to play the fiddle. He was an insurance guy, more interested in conversation and things other than doing business, which I understand. Maybe that's where I get some of it from. This picture means a lot to me. This is Marshall and Eric McLuhan. I think this is actually taken in Windsor, Ontario. And this to me just speaks such volumes. I have other pictures of Marshall being more of a playful father, which he certainly was, but he was also a very serious guy. And Dad Eric was born in 1942. It was another era, and Dad was really raised in the tradition. He went to very formal schools. He was taught by nuns, all this stuff. A lot of learning early. And he was kind of raised to be, to follow his father. I found, sort of to my delight, his report cards from grade 9 and 10 from De La Salle College in Toronto, where he didn't do very well. And comments from Marshall on the card were to the effect of, the teachers should do what they feel is best for him and not show him any favor, and he was disappointed him and all this stuff. And that made me laugh and feel kind of good, although it's funny to say that because that was certainly my experience in the same sort of time. I fell out of interest with school early on, and by grade 9 and 10 I was failing half my classes. I got kicked out of a high school. I got kicked out of another high school. Anyway, that's all to say that the fact that my dad did poor academically early on, then went on to be a brilliant scholar. I mean, brilliant, highly respected in various fields, gives me a bit of hope that, and because he thought that I could do this, it gives me a bit of confidence in myself, which is nice. And lastly, picture number 3, here is my Uncle Michael on the side with Marshall, and then my father Eric holding me. And this is from the summer of 1980, I think. Marshall would die a few months later. And it's one of very few pictures of me with Marshall. There's a couple of him holding me as a baby, which is really nice. But at this point, Marshall had had his stroke, and he wasn't communicating really very much, except very, very basic stuff. And he was just kind of living his life, and I tend to think that as frustrating as that would be for him, it was also a bit of a relief, because he was somebody who was always on, and this kind of forced him to try and relax and enjoy life, which would have been nice for his last year and a half when it wasn't, the worst thing ever for him. So I won't say much about Marshall as a father because he had 6 kids, and I know each of the kids had different experiences, and I don't know Marshall as a father myself, or as a grandfather, really. I was so young when he died. But I know that my dad enjoyed a very close relationship with him, and I can relate. in a way, because I enjoyed a similar, not nearly equal relationship to Eric, my dad. Eric did his best to get away from it. He went and joined the U.S. Air Force, ostensibly because he was born in the U.S. and was an American citizen and could have been drafted to the infantry. He instead volunteered for the Air Force, and went down to the States for that. And despite his best efforts, he got into the McLuhan thing via Finnegan's Wake, I believe, and ended up coming back and going down to New York City and Fordham University with Marshall, teaching classes down there with Harley Parker, and spent the rest of the next decade and a little bit working with Marshall alongside him, very much alongside him, co-authoring things, editing the Dewline newsletter, working on Laws of Media in the early 70s and finally publishing that in the late 80s. Working very, very closely with Marshall. So, I think he spent, and other family members feel free to correct me, but I think he enjoyed a closer relationship than a lot of them just by nature of their working relationship. And so I know he treasured those times, and I know how lost he must have felt when Marshall died, because that's how I feel now that, my own dad has died. And I spent the last 10 years sort of working with him. I mean, that's really, my relationship with my dad was not Eric's relationship with Marshall. I've always worked other jobs, except for when I did Marshall's inventory, and I was here at this desk full-time for about a year and a half. But whereas Dad worked full-time and very closely with Marshall, co-writing, researching, co-authoring, jamming, all this stuff, reading Finnegan's Wake, ours was a much more part-time relationship, and I wish it had been more, but it was what it was, and I hope it was enough to carry me through. Anyway, so my dad as a father, I think, was very different from Marshall because my dad and my mom really brought me up to try and find my own way, and I appreciate that very much. Although I ended up falling in love with the family biz, as it were, and wanting to be involved, I was definitely encouraged to go my own way, whatever way that would be. But here I am, doing my best to carry on anyway. Anyway, I made sure to tell my dad that I knew he did that, although I'm sure he would have preferred otherwise, and I thanked him for it, and made a nuisance of myself telling him how proud I was and how much I loved him all the time. So there you go. Speaking of Dad, something came up earlier. David Perel, who's a guy I know, we met in Toronto a while back, and he's a known person on the internet, on Twitter and stuff. Really cool guy, very interesting author, writer, intellectual, David Perel. Check him out on Twitter. Anyway, he made a post earlier about the Renaissance we're in, and that reminded me of one of the projects, and there are many projects here at the Institute to do, but one of the things, I think the first thing I want to do of Dad's, if I'm able to, is put out a collected volume of his speeches, because he gave many amazing speeches over the years, culminating in his last one, Media Ecology in the 21st Century, which next weekend at the Media Ecology Association meeting in Toronto at St. Michael's College, I'm going to be hosting a viewing of the recording of that. So if you're going to be in Toronto, I forget if it's Friday or Saturday, but let me know and I'll get you the details and sneak you in if I have to. It's an amazing speech. Ended up being basically his last word on anything. And I'm hoping to put it up on the McLuhan Institute YouTube page after the conference if I can get permission to do so. But as one of his speeches, one of his pet topics was on renaissances, and he discovered that there is a cycle of renaissances, and they happen fairly predictably. I came across this book. I didn't know he'd worked on a book, and I think his friend Malcolm McDowell, I think his name is, a friend of his, put this together with him, did the design and stuff, called The Phoenix Playhouse. Is there a subtitle? Renaissances, Past and Present. He gave a few speeches on this subject. I'll read you a little bit from the opening here. We are presently in the grip of the largest and grandest renaissance that the world has ever seen. Having begun in the middle of the 19th century, this renaissance shows no signs as yet of winding down. Instead, it shows every sign of accelerating. But renaissances are not often visible to those engaged in them. What we call the Renaissances, meaning the Renaissance of the 16th century, was actually an invention of the 19th century. Apparently, it took 2.5 centuries for people to recover from that convulsion enough that they could coin a word for it. Renaissance appears first in English in 1845, coinciding with the invention of the telegraph. Telegraph technology kicked off the Renaissance that still envelops us. In the sidebar, he says, I don't know how it has escaped attention before, but evidently the Western cultural experience marches to a subtle, pronounced rhythm. I began my research with the observation that we are presently in the grip of the largest and grandest renaissance that the world has ever seen. This should come as no surprise. ... It keeps going. Anyway, what Dad discovered was that we tend to have a flurry of activity we call a renaissance, a period of great innovation that accompanies major technologies, and it happens just about every 400 years. And we're in the middle of one right now that got kicked off with the start of telegraph and the beginning of our electric technologies that we're still working through, arguably. Some people will argue that we're into something else now. Who knows? Possibly, probably. Anyway, so that's part of one project. And that mercifully takes me to 15 minutes today. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for your support on the McLuhan Institute Facebook page. It's on Twitter and Instagram too, where I'll post some pictures of stuff tonight as I go along. And you can support me at patreon.com/McLuhan. I'd really appreciate it. Thanks, and maybe see you in Toronto. If you're in the area of a Tuesday night and want to come chat about libraries, books, McLuhan, none or all of the above, let me know. Good night.